Every empire has a beginning, a moment or several where a change occurs, and the trajectory of a country and its people are changed forever. Rome became an empire after the wars of the Second Triumvirate, in which Augustus was named Imperator of all Rome. After a great gathering, a warrior named Temujin became Genghis, great Khan of all the people of the steppes, and he would forge the Mongolian Empire. The moment that English settlers left for Jamestown, Bengal, and Cape Town, their efforts would create the largest entity to ever exist, the British Empire. The United States of America would also have its moment. Despite never formally being recognized as an empire, the 20th and 21st centuries would see the United States become a global hegemon, exerting influence in every pocket of the world through NATO, the Monroe Doctrine, as well as more direct military interventions post-World War II. The United States, alongside the USSR, would become the two superpowers of the world, both engaging in imperialist activity. The moment I refer to for the United States of America is the Spanish-American War of 1898. This war would see the United States transform from an isolationist state within North America to an expansionist world power with overseas territories and an appetite for more. That, however, will have to wait for another video. This video will be focusing on the Spanish-American War, the causes and effects, and how this relatively short war would contribute to America's rise. I will be getting in-depth accounts by using mostly primary sources. The written accounts of soldiers who fought during the war, the newspaper and journal articles about the war, and the treaties and accounts of politicians in the aftermath. I'll also quote some secondary literature that I read along the way to reinforce my viewpoint. This video will be cut into three sections. The pre-war period, where journalists were able to whip the American people into a war mood. The war period, in which Spanish, American, Cuban, and Filipino soldiers tell their stories. And the post-war period, the treaties and deals made by the United States and Spain. So, with that in mind, let's do some history. The causes of the Spanish-American War are numerous and complicated, so instead of giving you a detailed history on Spanish colonialism or the history of the New York press, I'm going to tell you three separate, independent stories. At the end of these three stories, I'll tell you how they intertwine into the Spanish-American War. Story 1. In 1897, William McKinley became the 25th President of the United States. Up until this point, McKinley was an economics guy and an isolationist. As a member of Congress and later governor of Ohio, McKinley advocated for high tariffs on foreign goods, as well as ensuring that the American dollar remained dependent on the gold standard. He would keep this attitude when he was elected to the presidency in 1897. During his presidential speech, McKinley made it clear that America should remain in its isolationist stance. We want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression. Whilst this is all well and nice, McKinley was voted in for his economic ideas, not his territorial ones. Americans wanted more than good paychecks. They wanted glory. Story 2. Now we shift to New York in the 1890s, where two newspapers dominate all others. The New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer, an American politician and media mogul, and the New York Journal, owned by William Hearst, who was an heir to a mining fortune. The two were locked in a battle for the readership of the city, yet neither could get ahead. Pulitzer kept his newspaper at 1 cent in an attempt to bankrupt Hearst, who, in return, raided Pulitzer for his staff, poaching them to work for him. They both would start publishing headlines only for the shock value, something that mirrors tabloids today. They would always attempt to outdo each other, and this would have serious consequences. Hearst was able to get the entire staff of a San Francisco hospital fired due to a story that was released in the journal. Both men wanted new and crazy stories in order to finally finish the other, and soon they would have their chance. Story 3. The Spanish Empire was one of the largest to ever exist. In the 1700s, Spain held territory from Argentina to California, yet only a century and a bit later, Spain had lost all of its American colonies except for Cuba. From 1868, Cuba had fought several wars against Spain, not all for independence. Some were for abolishing slavery and increasing the rights of Cuban citizens. By 1895, however, Cuba wanted out, and Spain was not yielding. Despite uprisings across the entire island, the Spanish occupation was fierce, with reports of concentration camps and Spanish cruelty. Spain and Cuba would reach a standoff in 1898, which would quickly change. This is where these three stories intertwine. The Cuban War was happening within the United States' backyard, and it was a very public war. The Cuban rebels had in fact made many pleas to the American people and government, yet McKinley was not interested in getting involved in the conflict, and many times urged Spain to find a peaceful resolution. The representatives of Spain, however, were not so diplomatic. In early 1898, the De Lome letters were leaked, in which the Spanish ambassador to the United States insulted the president, referring to him as a weak populist. Two people who were interested in getting involved, however, were Hearst and Pulitzer. As the war dragged on, both the World and Journal repeatedly printed sensationalist stories about what was happening in Cuba, again trying to outdo the other, both making claims about Spanish war crimes, often with very little evidence. It worked, however. The American public in New York and beyond had been whipped up into a war frenzy. Hearst and Pulitzer were able to play on the American sense of patriotism and portrayed the war as a New Age American war for independence, with the Spanish being the British and the Cubans being the Americans. Even despite popular support from the American public and members of his cabinet, McKinley still opted for patience, as was his nature. However, things changed in early 1898. Riots in Havana led to the destruction of several foreign businesses, which led to direct threats being levied against American interests and civilians. For the last few decades, due to the instability of the region, American investors were able to dominate Cuban production, which led to 90% of Cuban exports being sent to the United States. Hence, these same American interests were now directly threatened by Spanish loyalists in Cuba, who were upset with the American involvement so far. As we've discussed, McKinley was an economics guy and anti-war, so the idea of rioters destroying American businesses and harming American citizens in Havana was something that he could not allow. McKinley ordered the USS Maine to dock in Havana Harbor to ensure that American business interests were protected. On the 15th of February, 1898, the USS Maine exploded, killing 266 men aboard. Boom! Within minutes of the explosion of the USS Maine, information was already reaching Washington about the fatalities. No one could agree on how the ship exploded, but members of McKinley's cabinet were ready to label this as a Spanish attack. And that is exactly what was printed in the New York World and Journal over the next few days. Unfounded claims of Spanish torpedoes and bombs. Even with the destruction of the Maine, McKinley still opposed the war and wished for a diplomatic solution, but by this point it was too late. The American people were furious. After being fed stories of starving Cubans and Spanish war crimes, they had reached a tipping point. And the destruction of a United States Navy vessel, despite the ambiguity of its destruction, was the last straw. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Within 2 months of the Maine incident, all of McKinley's anti-war supporters had flocked to the other side, and he saw the writing on the wall. On April 19th, McKinley left the decision for Congress, and on April 25th, the United States of America declared war on Spain. Now, I'm not going to go through a play-by-play of the war, as there are other videos that can explain that better than myself. What I want to focus on is the individual accounts of soldiers, what their overall experience was, and how that would come to represent their broader country's involvement in the war. The first piece of evidence I want you to look at is a letter from Lieutenant John Blandon, one of the miraculous few who survived the explosion of the Maine. In a letter to his wife that he wrote the day after the explosion, he states that he was on watch when the explosion occurred, how the survivors scurried to the poop deck and attempted to save the wounded, only to find the majority of them already dead. The most curious aspect of John's letter, however, was the ending. After he had already signed his name, he said, "No one can tell what caused the explosion. I don't believe the Spanish had anything to do with it." Being an officer on board the ship would give him the credentials to identify whether or not an attack had happened, but it goes to show that the opinion of soldiers like John's didn't matter. The only opinions that did matter were those of Hearst and Pulitzer, who badly wanted a war in order to drive profits. Lieutenant Blandon would die 5 months after he wrote this letter from complications with PTSD. Now, not all of the war was fought in the Caribbean. At the same time as the Cuban revolt, Filipino separatists had also risen up, demanding independence from Spain. The United States decided on a two-front war, one in Cuba and the second in the Philippines. In fact, the first major engagement of the Spanish-American War wasn't in Cuba, it was in Manila. The battle occurred on the 1st of May, 1898, but the document we are looking at now is an action report from Commodore Dewey, who led the American fleet. Within his report, Dewey comments on the ineffective defense from the Spanish forces, such as mines exploding before the American ships near them, as well as the inaccurate shooting from the Spanish ships and land batteries. The Americans, however, were extremely effective. In his report, Dewey states that despite the superior number of Spanish ships aided with the coastal batteries, the American force did not lose a single ship, and the Spanish lost 11. Only one American serviceman died in the battle. Commodore Dewey would be promoted to Admiral of the Navy, the only person in the history of the United States to reach that status. This battle represents another aspect of the Spanish-American War that I haven't mentioned so far, the fact that this wasn't a fair fight. Spain was a dying empire, crippled by revolutionaries at home and abroad. The United States of America, however, was a young, hungry, and industrious nation. They were being led by the idea of manifest destiny, that all of North America should one day be their dominion. Their military strength was leagues ahead of Spain, and they had the home court advantage as well, as to fight this war, Spain would need to send troops from half a world away. So why did Spain fight if they knew that they were going to lose? They had to, for honor's sake. The Philippines and Cuba were the last vestiges of the once great Spanish Empire, and to lose them out of fight would cause more damage than an American navy ever could. Only a couple of months after the Battle of Manila, the Siege of Santiago would take place, after which Spain would sue for peace, ending the war. Before I speak about the Treaty of Paris and the subsequent effects of the war, I want to speak about a very peculiar address given to the American soldiers by the withdrawing Spanish soldiers. Before the Spanish forces withdrew to Spain, they gave the American forces a farewell speech in which they conveyed their gratitude and courtesy. They compliment the American forces, saying that they should be proud of their efforts. The Spanish soldiers say they hold no resentment in their hearts for the Americans, as they had won the war in a fair and dignified way. They express their high sentiment and appreciation, and wish them all the best. This really perplexed me when I first read it. Why would a vanquished force show their appreciation to an invader who, within 6 months, had completely wiped them out? Well, a theory that I believe is that this was the final of the Victorian Age wars, in which honour and a modern sense of chivalry still existed. After this, there would be no more honourable wars between two countries who respected one another. The deep-seated hate and animosity that World War I created has certainly come to mind. Nevertheless, after this speech, the Spanish departed, and the American flag was flown in Manila and Havana. On December 10th, just after 10 months since the USS Maine exploded, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and the American Empire was born. The treaty would have far-reaching effects, beginning the practice of the United States annexing overseas territories, bullying smaller neighbour countries, as well as emerging from its hibernation to become an active player in world events. But before we identify those effects, we need to understand what exactly was in the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris had 17 articles, but it is the first 3 that we are interested in, as seen here. Spain had to relinquish its claims in Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. What was controversial, however, is the fact that there was no path for statehood for these new territories. These colonies would remain as colonies, with the United States simply replacing Spain as their imperial overlord. The Philippines attempted to resist, but were soundly quashed in the American-Philippine War. Likewise in Cuba, the famous revolutionary José Martí, at the prospect of Cuba becoming a protectorate of the United States, would say, "Once the United States is in Cuba, who will drive them out?" So make no mistake, the United States in the end did not care about the liberty or care of the people of the Philippines or Cuba. They just wanted the land. This was a big step for the United States. Americans had long been guided by manifest destiny, the idea that America was to expand across the continental North America. But this was something completely different. The expansion of the United States to overseas territories. The United States had been founded as a state that opposed the absolute rule of a country across the seas. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States had become the very thing it had fought against almost 120 years before. Not all Americans were happy about this either. The American Anti-Imperialist League was formed to stop the acquirement of these new lands. They believed that the annexation of overseas territories, with no path to statehood or self-governance, was a gross breach of the republican principles that the United States was founded on. However, the average American simply didn't care. The idea of overseas conquest and American expansionism excited the average American, who wanted the United States to carve out their place in the sun. In my opinion, I think this was inevitable. In 1776, the United States was a small country on the east coast of North America, with the idea of manifest destiny to guide them, that the endless amounts of land to the west, south, and north would contain their fortune. The continental US is so big, I doubt they ever thought that they would run out of land. 120 years later, however, they reached the west coast and solidified their borders with British Canada in the north and Mexico to the south. They ran out of destiny to manifest. It's only natural to assume that they would now look overseas for their next conquest. At this point, the United States had become a contradiction. A nation built on the principles of equality, fraternity, and democracy had now annexed land that it had no intention on sharing those ideals with. America had now become an imperial nation. It did not take long for America to act on its newfound ambition. McKinley was able to use the Spanish-American War as a pretext for annexing Hawaii, which had come into American orbit in 1893, when the Hawaiian Queen had been overthrown. Stating the need for an American base in the Pacific, as well as fearing Hawaii might become the subject of a different colonial empire, in July of 1898, Hawaii was annexed. By this point, McKinley was a changed man. At the beginning of his term in office, he was an isolationist and believed in regulating the internal economics of the United States. Due to the popularity of the war and the wild successes that the United States had, however, he quickly changed his tune. He became a big supporter of American expansionism, and he fiercely fought for the United States to hold on to the Philippines after the war. He easily won re-election in 1900, running on a platform of American imperialism and the economic benefits it provided, though he would not see the end of his second term, as he was assassinated in September of 1901. His vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, of Battle of San Juan fame, would succeed him. Roosevelt would continue McKinley's imperialist policies. In 1903, Roosevelt would make a deal with Colombia to build a canal in Panama, which Colombia owned at the time. The canal, which would split Panama in half, would allow for the United States to merge navies and increase trade between its Pacific and Atlantic colonies. Unhappy with the terms presented to him, however, Roosevelt changed course and instead supported rebels in Panama who wished to create an independent state. Once the Panama rebels had established their new country, the United States immediately recognized them as a country and moved US troops and ships into the area. The United States then made it clear to Colombia that an attempt to take the territory back would mean war. Unable to take on the United States, there was nothing Colombia could do but accept the new American terms. The United States would then force Panama into protectorate status less than a year later and force them to make the same deal they had made with the Colombians, but for much better terms for the United States. Roosevelt presented himself as a conqueror to the American people, stating, "I took the isthmus," which was the land for the canal. "Let Congress not debate the canal, but debate me." Let's just take stock of where we are. On the left, we have the United States with all of its territorial progress in 1776, almost 120 years of slow progress. Within 6 years, it would evolve into the image on the right, a true global empire. In the 1890s, the United States was an isolationist country focused on internal issues, free trade, and sensible economic reform. By 1903, the United States had annexed Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Guam, as well as turned Cuba and Panama into protectorate states, as well as adopting an attitude of aggressive interventionism and imperialism. Within 10 years of the United States forcing vassalage on Panama, the canal would be complete, allowing the United States access to both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, which meant easy access to its imperial territories and a very stiff toll for any other ship who wished access. By this point, the economy of the United States now focused outwards, not inwards. So for growth to occur, the United States would have to keep expanding overseas. The United States had now firmly set itself down this road. Make no mistake, by 1903, due to the direct consequences of the Spanish-American War, the United States of America had become an empire. In 1898, when American diplomats arrived in Paris to ratify the treaty, the US Department of War released a seemingly innocuous memorandum. The memorandum reads, "We can no longer disregard international rivalries now that we ourselves have become a competitor in the worldwide struggle for trade." This comment would encapsulate the American position of international relations for the next century. The United States would repeatedly involve itself in world affairs, like the two world wars, and then it would engage in a war for ideology with the USSR for 50 years. The United States would come to overtake Europe and gain the respect and fear of the old colonial powers. In this time, the American empire would prosper, initiating military interventions in sovereign countries, planning coups d'etats across the globe, forcing regime change, as well as creating more protectorate states, as well as the construction of military bases across the globe, many of which are still in use today. Despite Cuba being a fully independent country today, the United States still operates the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, territory they took from Cuba during the Spanish-American War. There is no one factor that led to the Spanish-American War and the subsequent rise of the American empire. It was a multitude of factors that snowballed. It was the natural evolution of manifest destiny. It was the warmongering attitudes of Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst. It was the burgeoning military-industrial complex that desperately wanted a war to test their mettle against. It was a president too powerless to stop the tide who was eventually corrupted when he saw the money and power that could be made with imperialism, and it was the dying empire who was simply too proud to hand their land over. The one undisputable fact, however, is that this was the war that led to the creation of the mighty American empire, the empire that would surpass all others in military and industrial might, the empire that is slowly starting to decay away today. Thank you for watching.